Good evening. My name is Paul Larner, and I am head of school at Wakefield Country Day School. Tonight is a true pleasure because I get to welcome back via Zoom Mrs. Jessica Lindstrom, our head of school from 2012 to 2020. Mrs. Lindstrom will interview Tim Nolan, Rappahannock County resident and former employee of the CIA. Mr. Nolan has a particular interest in teaching economics. As a reminder, our next seminar is March 10th, where our own Dr. Stuart Ginsburg will interview Dr. Brian Shaw, who, among his other endeavors, operates a charity pediatric orthopedic surgery clinic in Guatemala. Please submit any questions to Mr. Nolan via the chat feature, and Mrs. Lindstrom will select the questions to ask at the end of the interview. Mrs. Lindstrom, I turn it over to you as my predecessor and former head of school.
Thank you very much, Mr. Larner, for the introductions and for the invitation to be here. It's great to be back. And thank you, Mr. Nolan, for agreeing to join us this morning and give us all the information you have regarding the deficit and economics in general. I do have one disclaimer, which is for me to be the interviewer of an economist is a bit laughable, for I had one microeconomics class when I was a freshman in college, and I have to admit that it was a disaster. It was the worst grade I had on my transcript. But I'm hoping tonight to be able to learn and understand what this 18-year-old brain was incapable of comprehending. So I'm glad to be here. And I do want to let you know, in our audience, we have a number of Wakefield Country Day School students, as well as faculty, as well as grandparents and people in our wider community. So you have a great audience and a difference in backgrounds and ages that will be listening to you this evening. And I also want to suggest to the audience that you put your Zoom on speaker view instead of gallery, because Mr. Nolan is going to be sharing slides via PowerPoint, because he said graphics oftentimes help to illuminate what it is he's saying in his topic. So without further ado, we'll get started. And my first question actually has to do with your title, the title of the program, Tim. You say it's the federal budget deficit, really? Question mark. And when I first saw it, I had to laugh a little, wondering what the tone was. What was that tone? Does it mean that we shouldn't worry about the deficit because it's too preposterously big, or is it not what we should take seriously? What do you mean by your title, and what should we take away with that from that?
Yeah, thanks. Well, first of all, I wanted to appreciate the chance to do this interview. Thanks to Mr. Larner and to you, Jessica, for arranging it. So, you know, the answer to the question you raised was, I sort of asked myself that too. And there's multiple answers that can be given when you use the word, I understand what the deficit is, but when the word really appears, then I wonder, some people could say, really, you mean there is one? Or really, is it that high? Or really, is it that low? Or is it just about right? Or I don't really care. So it's an interesting way of putting the title, and I hope to shed some light on it. One thing I wanted to do before getting into the answers, or to try to answer your first question, is to say a couple things about the interview. One is I try to use graphics to illustrate this, some of these points that I'd like to raise. So I'll be a small picture box while the graphic is there, and I'll be talking about the graphic. The other point I wanted to raise is that I don't try to be able to put any value on if the deficit is bad or if it's good or too high or too low. I think there's a tendency to give an opinion about it, when really the most important thing is to understand what it is and how it works. And once we can do that, then we can ask, you can begin to say, well, I don't know about that. It may be too high, or maybe too low. So with that, I will get on with my screen here, I hope. So this is where, is that okay?
I can see a black screen that says Tim.
You okay, everybody? Is that working?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay. So I start with cartoons. Cartoons are funny, they can be humorous, but they also are really there to illustrate a point. So let's look at the one on the left. So there's a guy standing on a ladder, and he's sawing a hole in the roof because the deficit is going through the roof. So that tells you something about his view that he has to saw a hole in the roof to actually allow for the deficit to expand. The other one is on the right. You see Santa Claus, who's dressed up there as the U.S. Congress. And this child looks in distress, holding a piece of paper that's very long with the title National Debt and a whole bunch of scribble. Obviously, the piece of paper is enormous. And the child is saying, please, I'm begging you, no more presents, as if to say, I don't need this, which is an important point because the debt is shared by, and you're responsible by future generations. So it's something that we have to be aware of, especially if you're young, because ultimately the debt gets passed down. Anyway, that's the way I get into this. A little bit of humor.
Those are good. I was just going to say, definitely a little bit of humor, but something that is a very serious subject matter, especially now with the pandemic raging. How tied to the deficit is the pandemic?
Beg your pardon?
How tied to the deficit is the pandemic?
Well, yeah, it's tied very much because if, the thing is, we have to understand that the future of the U.S. economy is tied very much to curing the pandemic. And I think everybody sort of can appreciate that, but it's worth saying that the extent to which the U.S. economy is able to grow hinges upon whether the pandemic is addressed, and the sooner the better. And I'll show you some data to prove my point. One thing I'd like to do before I do that, I've got some data I wanted to share with you here. I'm going to read it just to illustrate a couple things, and then I'll go on to the next graphic. In 2020, the U.S. economy shrunk almost 4%, which was the worst since 1946. Very low job. The last 3 months, job gains have only been 29,000, which is 100,000 less than you need to keep up with the growth of population. We've got 10 million people unemployed, 4 million have dropped out of the labor market, and 2 million are working part-time who would really like to work full-time. Over the next 10 years, the U.S. economy will lose $16 trillion, of which half of that is economic losses, and the other is the other kinds of loss. So it'll be a big loss. It's a whole lot of money. The entire U.S. economy is about 21 trillion right now. So spread out over 10 years, that's a whole lot. So I wanted to jump to the next slide here just to show you. I'm going to explain this slide. You got on this axis here, you've got the impact of the pandemic on gross domestic product, which is 20% going up, and then these are all ones that are going down. So it looks like if you look at what's being really impacted, and you look at way out here, you can see the ones that the most, the greatest impact, arts and accommodation and food. And we know that, and retail trade is next, healthcare, education. But when it gets down to agriculture, not so much. So again, it's not like the whole economy is slowed down. It's definitely oriented in a few economic sectors. The unemployment rate went up to 15% at the beginning. This was like last April and May. And it's since that time has gone down to around 7%. As I say, back then we had lost 20 million jobs, and now it's down to 10 million, approximately. Jump to the next slide. Unemployment. It's kind of hard to see here. You can see the bottom. So there's that figure back in April, 14%, 14.5%, and we're down to 6.7% now. But look over on the far left. If you look at January, and if I had stuff for the previous year, it would show the unemployment rate as being right around 3.5 to 3.8%. So that gives you an idea where we're at. So even though it's fallen over the months, it's still twice as much than what it was prior to that happening. Excuse me, I'm just gonna get a drink of water.
So with the money that Congress is putting forth to handle the pandemic, the stimulus that's going to increase the deficit so that hole in the roof can be cut and the line on that chart can keep going, is it money that is backed by anything, or is it, do we just print the money, or is there something substantial behind it when we?
That's a complicated answer, but in short, yes. And I'll get to the explanation a little bit down the line here, but basically it is. Again, looking at the losses, this is kind of hard to understand after I put it up there, but it just shows you, if you look at the over here on the side here, these are all amounts below, showing you the loss, billions of dollars, and the screen goes out to 2030, again showing that in terms of gross domestic product, which is the value of production, we're losing 10 trillion over the next 10 years.
Wow.
Okay, so let's get into it. And what I wanted to say is first of all, what, really, so what is the deficit? And it's pretty simple. It's just like a household, right? If you spend more, or if you have more debt than income, then you have a deficit, or a household has one. So on the far, the orange tile over there shows you that if the government spends more than it collects in taxes, then that money is a deficit. So it's inflow and outgo. Now, that creates a deficit, and automatically that deficit gets added on to the the total debt. So the total debt is the sum of all previous deficits plus any surpluses which were able to pay off a portion of it. So as you can see, speaking about the virus, I think it's pretty clear that I think we've spent $4.5 trillion so far on COVID relief. And as far as I can tell, every penny of that has not come from tax revenues. That's all been deficit spending. So let's take a look at spending and pros and cons. And let's go through the pros here. And obviously, one big one is economic growth. So if you can create a deficit which results in spending, okay, by the government, by households, by businesses, then the economy grows. By growing, of course, it will generate more spending, and that'll reduce unemployment. And the other benefit is that if it's spent for dams and bridges and roads and that kind of thing, then that's also helpful. The main one is here for economic growth. How about the cons? Of course, the national debt goes up, which is what I was here earlier. We have to pay interest on the debt. I'll show you that in a moment, how much that is. Going back to that baby on the cartoon, that creates a future burden. It has to be paid because a portion of your taxes in the future is going to be going to paying off interest on the debt. So obviously, if the debt gets higher, so too is going to be the burden. And the final one is possibly controversial. If too much deficit is being spent, we risk inflation. And this is the reason I put the arrow there is really the conflict which exists between whether the economy grows or if it grows too fast, whether prices end up going up and inflation results. So that is a delicate balance that has to be judged. Now, right now we got a debate going on about that right now because President Biden wants to spend close to $2 trillion on more relief, which will certainly create economic growth. Estimates are that it'll raise economic growth by 3 to 4%. But other economists are saying, hold on, because it's possible that the growth will be too fast and production will not be able to assimilate all that spending, resulting in only price growth. So it's a tricky situation. And I don't think, again, this is where for those who are interested in this, it's a matter of going, don't know, honestly, whether one or two, or the two of them are going to occur 1 or 2 years along.
Tim, I have a question. If I get a stimulus check, but I don't spend it, I put it in the bank and save it, does that then not help economic growth?
That's a great question. The answer is no, it does not help. Yeah. In fact, that's a critical point because if everybody took their check and put it into their savings account, what it would mean is that spending would be zero.
Right.
And so
the key
what
is
would be the
spend.
impact on employment? Yeah. So yeah, I mean,
So
this is an important point that you know, what we say is that, you know, it's right now consumer spending in the US economy is about 2/3 of everything, all spending. So clearly, go ahead.
Is paying the rent spending or
Yeah.
not?
Oh yeah, it's all
Okay.
spending. In economics, there's only 2 things that households are doing. They either spend or they don't spend. If they don't spend, that's to save. And so every additional amount spent over and above what people had originally thought they wanted to do is, of course, going to increase a little bit of economic growth. On the other hand, if they decide to save it, then it's not spent at all, and it doesn't have any impact.
Right.
can you all see the dates on the bottom?
I can if I move my gallery pictures.
Can everybody see those dates? 'Cause,
Yes, I can see them.
okay, so
Yeah.
I can't see them, so let's take a look at this now. First of all, try to understand this. Okay, you see up there is the balanced budget. So that line all the way across there is everything is balanced. In other words, taxes equal government spending. Everything below the line is a deficit. Everything above the line is a surplus. And so that's one thing. So as you can see on that line, what do you see happening? You see budgets, deficit budgets getting larger and larger and larger, with the exception of 4 years in the late 90s. And the other thing, what's that black line at the bottom? I can't read it. What does that show at the bottom? Is it, unfortunately, I can't.
This is 2015.
Yeah, let's see if I can. Oh, there it is. Okay. All right. Now I'm better. Okay. So if you look at history, you can see that basically up until 1933, we had no deficit at all. And the debt was zero, as this red line shows. Then beginning in the early 70s, when the US dropped out of the gold standard, it made the dollar the free currency and the major currency of the world. Then deficit spending, and I'll go back to this one, began to grow. And so the accumulation of all of these red lines is the national debt red line. And you can see it growing and growing after that. So, sorry. What I'm trying to get at here is that we can clearly see that post 1971, that deficits became far more characteristic of the economy than prior to that time. And I'll show you why that's important in just a moment. I wanted to mention, you mentioned the budget. So in 2020, here was the budget and how it was distributed. And this little wedge up here, this little piece of pie, 6% of the federal budget was the net interest paid on the national debt. The number 223, that's billion. So that's what we're paying based on the accumulation. If I go back to all these deficits that are the red lines here, draw interest, and of course that's shown by an annual interest payment that our tax payments have to help pay for.
So we're just paying interest and not principal, right?
Yeah, no, this is just interest on the bonds that are financed. Now I'm going to try to explain how this works. You asked earlier about how it's done. Basically, the US Treasury Department sells bonds, and those bonds are sold to private individuals, to foreign governments, and to the Federal Reserve Bank. And currently about 45% of the bonds used to finance the deficit are sold right to the Fed, Federal Reserve Bank. The other 30% or so are sold to foreign governments to a large extent. The balance is to individuals here in the US. So what happens is the Treasury sells a bond to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve has to buy that bond. The Fed creates money, okay, creates an increase in the money supply, and instead of keeping it to themselves, they deposit it into the banks of commercial banks around the US. and those commercial banks end up lending that money out. And that's how the money supply grows, and that's how spending occurs. So if the Biden plan for two trillion passes, the Federal Reserve will buy maybe half of that, or $1 trillion. It'll create the money, increase the money supply by $1 trillion. It'll deposit that money into member banks, the banks that are part of the Fed group, of which there are thousands. Will deposit them, that will become an asset in the bank's account. And banks will then go ahead and lend that out. Now, interest rates are extremely low right now. And so that money stands a pretty good chance of being loaned out because interest rates are so low at the present time. So going back to this, that's the 6%. The rest of this is pretty explanatory. Healthcare and Social Security, about half the budget, those are fixed, right? So discretionary is right down here, very small amount. Education, infrastructure, health, environment, and so forth. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit now about how this all happens. It's under the term fiscal policy. That's the policy of the Congress, basically. So the Congress is responsible for taxing and spending. So let's take a look at this one over here. Let's say there's a recession going on. If there's a recession going on, tax revenues go down and government spending goes up to compensate for that. Because if tax revenues go down, then automatically then the government is spending more. Assuming the budget is the same, that's how that works. If there's inflation, then what's going to be happening is that the government's going to raise taxes, or can do that, and government spending will fall down and will lower. The reason why this is happening is the way you curb inflation is to cut spending. And the way the government does it is to increase taxes to slow down inflation from households, slow spending, and government spending reduced after that. Okay, this is kind of an interesting one. I want to just flip back. I'll go back to this one again quickly. You see this one here. You notice that the debt and deficits started to grow in the 70s. And before that time, they're pretty low. I'm sorry, go back again. Let's go back to 1933, the Great Depression, because there was a slight increase in the debt after World War II. So let's see this line beginning to grow higher. So in other words, the debt is getting larger. Keep touch with that. Here's 1933 again. So what do you see the difference between pre and post that year? Let's look at pre. Look at the economy. The brown lines indicate, or bars show downturns, economic downturns. The blue bars show economic expansions. But what do you get from that? You see a very, very mixed picture of up and down and up and down. Look at it in terms of that beginning after that. Look at the predominant bar is the expansionary bar, showing, and also the length of the bar is the number of months which it is going on, and the width, of course, is the time period, which is down here. So I'm not trying to promote deficits. So I want you to be clear of that. So I'm not saying that that's great, but they have resulted in a lot more, it looks like they've resulted in a lot more economic growth than the previous time period when we didn't have any.
It seems counterintuitive.
How's that?
Just that going into debt can be positive.
Well, this is the mystery, and I might say this is one thing that happens is oftentimes people look at their own situation,
right,
and say that the debt for me, if I have a deficit, that's hurting me. But to then jump to say, is that the same thing as what helps the entire US economy? Not necessarily so, because the indications here are, if I'm to read, going back again, if I go back to this, I look at all these deficits right here, and what do I see? As a lot of growth occurring as a result. And I attribute that largely to those deficits, because those deficits generate a lot of consumer spending and business investment too. So it can't be proven, but I think there's a strong case for that. Here's what's going on with the deficit in terms of its total. So down, if we go back to 1970, the percentage of deficit as a percent of gross domestic product was right around, what, 35%, something like that. Then it kind of drops down. And then beginning in 1982 or 3, you see it begin to take off. And there it grows, it's getting bigger. And this line here, where the blue or the red line is where the total deficit equals gross domestic product. So you can see beginning in late 1915, it crossed over into 100% plus. So right now, up until the beginning of COVID, we were running about 105%. In other words, the total debt was 5% in excess of that year. I'm sorry, the total deficit was 105% or 5% more than gross domestic product. And look what happened here. It just jumped sky high because of COVID. So these are the various programs that Congress passed in 2020, the CARES Act.
Right.
I put this one in just to show you a little bit about, again, looking at how forecasts are made, which are very inexact, okay? So it's done with a whole lot of what they think is going to happen, and of course that oftentimes happens. So this goes out to 2025, and this orange gap here shows you the gap of uncertainty with respect to what the deficit is going to be,
right,
additional is going to be every year. So we just don't know. The red line going down is the most likely path forward. I personally think that this is going to have to be revisited because I think it's going to be higher. The final thing I want to show you is what are our goals right there? It says debt goals. So let's talk about some goals. We know we have a large, the deficit is huge. We know that. But what do we want to do about it? So let's take 4 different cases and see what it would take to change things around. Let's look at the first one. It says, let's keep the debt at the current share of gross domestic product, which is right around, this is before this jump here. So this is like 105%. So it's 5% greater. So what would it take to keep that debt from growing any higher? And what it would cost is, over 10 years, it would cost $3.3 trillion. So we'd have to collect that money somehow.
Right.
And what's that mean? It means taxes would have to go up. Let's suppose we want to reduce the debt modestly so that it's 70% of GDP. Well, we'd have to then collect $5.3 trillion. And the next one is, suppose we want to reduce the debt down to 2010 amount. Going back to this, 2010 would be right around here. So that's looking at around 80% of GDP. Okay, so that's going to cost 8.1 trillion over 10 years. And then the final thing is, do we want to balance the budget by 2027? So in other words, we'd want to end up with this deficit then so we have to budget the balance. We have to balance the budget by 2027. What would we have to do? We'd have to collect $8.2 trillion over the next 10 years. So what's the message here? The message is, what is economic policy going to be? Is it going to be one that emphasizes balanced budgets? If so, I don't think there's any way to do that without a tax increase. If, on the other hand, we choose ones that are smaller amounts here, then we got a chance of doing that. It gets down to what the Congress wants to do. So clearly, this is an unacceptable situation, because we're now up to almost 135% of gross domestic product. So it's going to take a lot. So my guess is, we have to decide where our priorities actually are. Do we want to leave them as they are now? Or if we want to balance the budget and not have a deficit, how are we going to pay for that? Because there's the cost right there. And sorry, I know you wanted to ask questions. I kind of got carried away, but hope that's okay.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very, very, very much. It sure seems that the minute you say raise taxes, I can just hear everyone going, not me, not me. I have one question that actually comes from my 28-year-old son. He's wondered, has the federal government ever considered something like a lottery the way the states have? Wouldn't that bring in lots of money, or just on the aspect of
it would bring
gambling,
in a ton of
Congress never touch it?
Bring in a ton of money. The downside is it reduces spending. It's unlikely that it would come out of savings, although it might, depending on your income level. But for most of us, participate in a lottery like that would probably take having to have that money come out of spending, so spending would decrease. But in terms of raising money, absolutely. I don't know what the forecasts are of how much that amounts to, but it could be substantial.
Here's a question. If I go out and buy products made in China with my stimulus money, does that help the US economy?
The answer is yes and no. It helps Walmart, but the producer is going to get most of that spending. And the producer is China, so China will end up, I don't know what Walmart's markup is on their products, but let's say it's 25%. Then for every dollar you spend at Walmart, the US economy gets 25 cents of that. China gets the remainder. So it would have some effect. not like a production here.
Right. Okay, here's another one. These are great questions. Modern monetary theory suggests that the deficit doesn't matter if inflation is acceptable. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I've been reading about the modern monetary theory. I'm a little bit old-fashioned on that. Currently, there are many governments right now where interest rates are negative. For instance, in Japan, they're very negative right now, 15% negative type. So, I mean, it's certainly easy to finance debt like that, but what it means is basically you can expand debt in an unlimited way because interest rates are so extremely low. So everybody would, in a sense, want to own bonds because they're being paid to hold them.
Right.
So I don't necessarily believe that that's been proven yet, although that's why it's modern and it's only been around for a few years. So I have my doubts.
What about, do you believe that gold is a solid hedge against inflation? Here's another question.
Okay, so that's a good question because the short answer is yes, because a lot of businesses are buying gold right now. I just read an article where Tesla is buying gold.
Right.
And so that's kind of interesting. You know, gold prices are close to $2,000 an ounce and could go higher. So, yeah, it's a good deal.
Mm-hmm. Very much so. Another question here. Do you have a favorite economist that you follow or you recommend others follow on the national level?
Yeah, good question also. There's so many. I actually follow one that's, I mean, I use ones that have a proven record in terms of what they published. And I go back to Samuelson actually, because it's a commonly used textbook. And Paul Samuelson was a very well-known economist, and his analysis in his textbooks are still widely used, I think, even at the college level still. So yeah, he'd be my first choice. Currently, I like what Janet Yellen says, because was an economist, it still is, but she's the now in Biden's administration. But she has a good record of publishing and is well known, and I think has been doing some really good work looking at unemployment and for labor. So I like that in her.
Very good. Here's another one from a faculty member. Since the US government is the ultimate issuer of the dollar, it is a mathematic certainty that private dollar assets are government debt? Let me read that again because it sounded like I garbled it. Since the US government is the ultimate issuer of the dollar, it is a mathematic certainty that private dollar assets are government debt.
Well, that's saying that what we have is really debt for the government, unless I'm not reading that. Would you mind saying that again? I'm not quite.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll explain it. So basically, like, I mean, I can show you the graph if you want to screen share it, but it's like basically every dollar that we have in our bank account ultimately must be US debt. Does that make sense? So in other words, like, the US government runs a deficit, that means we have dollars. And when the US government runs a surplus, that means they take our dollars ultimately, right? So if there is to be dollars in the economy, ultimately the US government must issue debt.
Well, what if it's a balanced budget? Suppose we we don't have to do that anymore, or choose not to do that anymore.
But then we wouldn't have dollars in our bank accounts. Our bank accounts would basically be zero.
I'm sorry, I don't really follow that. There's might be a confusion between what we have and what the government has. You're right. Every time you look at a dollar bill, it's a note. If you go to the bank and you want gold for it or some kind of currency, they're going to say, no, we can't do it. So it is a debt, but it's a medium of exchange. So, and it has value. So I don't see how that would really affect how the government owns it, if I'm understanding your point.
Right, here's one more. Do you think it is a good idea for the USA to borrow long-term to invest in the United States infrastructure? I know this is opinion.
Yeah, this is, I do. I mean, our infrastructure is in pretty bad shape from what I have read and from what I can see. So yeah, I mean, it would make, I mean, what's happened is that Congress has put off doing anything about infrastructure for a long time. And that's been a political decision, but now it's an imperative. So I would, and it's good because it supplies jobs, it creates jobs and it creates income. So and really interestingly enough, if it creates income, it creates tax revenue, which ultimately is used to offset the deficit. So I think that would be a wise level of spending, and I hope they end up spending it after this COVID period goes on. If the Congress is willing, we could easily spend $1 trillion or $2 trillion on infrastructure.
Here's someone saying, do you have thoughts on the reset theory?
No, I don't know what the reset theory is.
I don't either.
Is there any explanation?
The person who asked that, are you on to be able to explain? No? All right, I will go to another one. I believe this is from a student. Because the pandemic, due to the pandemic, many employees lost their jobs and therefore will have trouble paying taxes this April. Has the government ever forgiven or reduced taxes in times of crisis?
No.
Okay.
That's a great, I mean, it's an interesting point, actually, but the only time that there's been tax cuts, and we had a huge one in 2020 or 2017, 1.7 trillion, I believe it was. So yeah, I mean, if we do, there are times when that could happen, but I don't
think it would
see it happening.
Yeah,
I just don't see it happening.
Yeah. If interest rates were to return to normal levels, how would that impact the federal debt? What does history tell us about the danger of allowing national debt to grow too high?
Well, it would increase the debt payment every year. The interest on it would go up. So instead of paying whatever it was 6% for last year, it could go up 10, 15%. I don't know, but it certainly does have I mean, I'm not trying to say, speak in favor of creating debt, but I'm saying if it has to be done, deficit spending right now is a terrific deal because interest rates are so low. The 30-year Treasury bond, which is the one that would be sold to the Fed, is actually 1.9%. I mean, that's pretty cheap money. If that interest rate goes up to historical levels, which is like around 4.5%, then that would really be an expensive deal. So, you know, it's something we have to be aware of. But if we have to, I mean, we decided through our Congress to spend on this COVID relief, so we're getting a decent deal right now because interest rates are relatively low. If they go up, yeah, a bigger burden for sure. And it would make people begin to think more about if that's a good idea to create more and more debt over the years. I mean, we ended up, I hate to go back to this again here, but let me just go back to this. We are in a period where we've had a historical almost 50 years here where we've had spending increased larger than tax revenues. And getting over that hurdle is not going to be easy. But we as people are going to have to decide, is that really what we want? Because if we want to reduce the deficit and reduce the debt, we have to be prepared to pay taxes. There's no way around it.
There are countries that are in debt to us. Is that correct? Is there a way that we could demand money back if we needed to?
Yeah, I suppose we could ask, but I mean, these are long-term bonds. Once the terms are set, if it's a 30-year bond, you can't say, well, I'm going to reduce it to 10 years. No, it's just, it's not going to happen.
Is there any?
So yeah, I mean, it's.
Go on, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, one teacher has asked, is there ever a fear that we will actually go bankrupt if we don't curtail this?
Well, again, my answer to that is, if you're thinking in terms of households going bankrupt or businesses going bankrupt, it's not a clear connection between those two instances and the federal government. The federal government is not going to go bankrupt. And the reason why it's not going to go bankrupt is that it collects a tax every year, and it also finances spending by selling bonds, and by doing that creates money. So we don't have that capability, and so we can't do that. And we can go bankrupt easily. A business can go bankrupt easily, but the federal government is not going to go bankrupt. And I don't want to be held to that for 100 years from now. But I don't think, if you talk to any economist with a track record and who's involved in this area, they're going to tell you that it's not going to happen. Is the deficit going to be with us? Yes. Is the national debt going to increase? More than likely. Those are givens because of our history.
Right.
You sell a third.
Go on, the last minute. We're about out of time, but I was just going to say, I like ending with that note that we won't go bankrupt.
Very reassuring. I can sleep well tonight.
Actually.
Yeah, sleep well. Your government is spending your money. Anyway, hope this was helpful.
Thank you. And students have questions for you. Would you be willing to communicate them with them via email if I gave your email address to teachers?
Sure, yeah. The gentleman who asked the question that I didn't answer very well, and I forgot who he was, but he raised an interesting point. I didn't feel like I covered that very well, having to do with the government owning all of our income, or owning all of our dollars. That's something, if that person would be willing to frame a question like that, I'd like to see if I can to answer it.
That would be great. All right, well, I thank you
Well,
so
yeah,
much
sure.
for joining us this evening.
Tim and Jessica, thank you very much. And Tim, that's a marvelous collection of slides that you've got. If you could maybe email us just the slideshow, you've got a wonderfully simple group of slides to display the topic that you've just spoken about. So thanks again.
Good. I'm glad you liked it. And it was a pleasure being with all of you.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Wakefield Country Day
You bet.
School. It's great to see everybody.